St. Gregory Palamas was born in the year 1296. He fell asleep in the Lord in 1359. St. Gregory was an aristocrat. He grew up at the imperial court. He had both a secondary and a post-secondary education. St. Simeon, the new theologian, had accepted to have a secondary education, but had refused the post-secondary education. In the case of St. Gregory Palamas, he accepted both, so he is very well schooled, very well educated. Part of his education, which was typical at the time, involved an immersion in philosophy, and he specifically studied Aristotle under the recognized master of Aristotelian philosophy at that time. His master was Metochitis, and Metochitis was recognized as a master of Aristotelian philosophy, and St. Gregory was one of his best, if not his best, pupil. He had some formative influences on him in his youth. One is Patriarch Athanasios I, and the other one is Metropolitan Theodiptos of Philadelphia. These are very well-known hierarchs in the Orthodox Church. We would call them hesychasts, and they had a very substantial formative influence, spiritual and theological influence, on St. Gregory in his younger days. Patriarch Athanasios I and Metropolitan Theodiptos of Philadelphia. In the year 1316, St. Gregory left the world, so to speak, as we like to say, for the monastery, in this case for the Holy Mountain, for Mount Athos. His father had already died. He had a mother still living, two sisters, servants because they were aristocratic, so servants were of course part of the household. The servants and two sisters went to monasteries in Constantinople, and St. Gregory and two brothers went to Mount Athos. So the family was distributed among various monasteries. When he came to Athos, he spent 3 years near the famous monastery of Vatopedi. Vatopedi Monastery is very much aware of that to this day and really claims St. Gregory Palamas as their own. He was associated with that monastery. His younger brother Theodosios died, fell asleep in the Lord. His spiritual father died also at around that time. From there he went to the great Lavra monastery on Mount Athos with his other brother. 3 years later we find him at a hermitage. And then for a period of time, St. Gregory went to Thessaloniki. He had to leave Athos because during that time Athos was subject to attack by Turkish pirates who pillaged the monasteries on Athos, and it was dangerous at certain periods to stay there. Many of you know that the large monasteries on Mount Athos, at least most of them, are fortified so that they could resist attack. Nevertheless, it was extremely difficult for the monks. And a number of monks during this time period left the Holy Mountain for periods of time for survival and then came back when they were able to do so. St. Gregory was one of those monks who left the Holy Mountain as a monk, continued the monastic life, went to Thessaloniki, which if you were to look on the map is not far from the Holy Mountain. And he entered the spiritual circle of a well-known Isidore, who was the disciple of St. Gregory of Sinai. It seems doubtful that St. Gregory of Sinai and St. Gregory Palamas, the two St. Gregories who are identified as being key spokesmen of hesychasm, ever met each other in person. However, they certainly must have known about each other, and through the holy Isidore, St. Gregory entered into the spiritual circle, St. Gregory Palamas entered into the spiritual circle of St. Gregory of Sinai. That Isidore was to later become patriarch. And so you can see all of the Patriarch of Constantinople, all of the important connections. St. Gregory was ordained to the priesthood at 30 years of age, which remains still in the canons of the Orthodox Church, even though it is often not followed. The standard, the canonical age for ordination to the priesthood is 30. So he was ordained at 30. In other words, he became a hieromonk, hieromonachos, and he actually, in the year 1326, founded a hermitage on his own. He gathered disciples there, which was rigorously ascetic in its typikon. Typikon is the rule of a monastery. The monks there spent 5 days of the week in silence and seclusion, and 2 days with the community for worship together. In the year 1331, he returned to Mount Athos. It was safer for him to do that at that point. He was at the St. Savas hermitage there. Briefly, he became the abbot of the famous Esphigmenou monastery on Mount Athos, which is not far from Vatopedi, where he started. He then returns to St. Savas hermitage. So he had to move around to many different places. This is unusual in the monastic life, but it was not at all unusual in this time period when monks had to move around simply to survive. We might never have known all of this about him. As you can see, we know a lot about his life. Had St. Gregory not encountered another person by the name of Barlaam. Barlaam was a Greek from Calabria. Just to put that into context for those of you, I'm sure you all know, but Calabria is in Italy, and Calabria was Greek-speaking. So people who came from there came from what had become culturally the West, but linguistically they were Greek-speaking and Orthodox. So Barlaam, who came from there, of course had a direct connection with the Eastern Christian Empire, with Orthodoxy, and of course linguistically he was connected. However, he had been exposed to education in Western Europe, and Barlaam was very well educated. He was a scholar and a philosopher. In many respects, we might consider him a type of humanist. There is a particular type of humanism which was at that time fairly influential. He's quite Neoplatonic in his orientation. This is Barlaam, not St. Gregory Palamas. Quite Neoplatonic in his orientation philosophically. He left the West, in a sense, to return to his Orthodox roots, and he went to Constantinople, where he was very well received. He was a very impressive man, and the people in Constantinople were impressed with his erudition, with his level of education. He was a Dionysian scholar. By that I mean that he studied St. Dionysios the Areopagite, which means, of course, that he stressed the unknowability of God, which is what we would expect him to do if he studied St. Dionysius. And St. Barlaam lectured in Constantinople, became well known, and as he stayed there, he became more and more familiar with the life of the church there. At a certain point, he decided to acquaint himself with monastic life, and of course, if you wanted to acquaint yourself with monastic life, you would visit not only the monasteries of Constantinople, you would go a little bit further into Macedonia, and you would go to Mount Athos, and you would get good exposure to the monastic life there. This he did. He was very shocked by what he found. He, of course, really didn't know anything about monastic life in the Orthodox Church, and although he had the linguistic connection, he spoke Greek very well, he nevertheless was not familiar with the spiritual practices of Orthodoxy. And although he went to Constantinople, in a sense, to return to his roots, when he got a close look at monastic life on Athos and elsewhere, he discovered something which scandalized him. He watched the way the monks were praying. The monks didn't think anything about it. They were just simply praying. They didn't realize there was any particular issue. But Barlaam, when he saw what they were doing, was scandalized by this. He saw them praying the Jesus prayer. He saw a number of monks seated in their cells, a number of them on small stools, with their heads inclined towards the heart, praying. He saw some of them using breathing techniques to enhance the rhythm of their prayer. He began to speak with them, to ask them what they thought they were doing. And they explained to him that they were praying the Jesus prayer. He asked them more. They began to tell him more. They began to speak about the uncreated light. What is this uncreated light that you are talking about? Barlaam asked. And of course, the monks very innocently shared their experiences with him. And once Barlaam understood the essence of what they were doing, he was even more scandalized than he had been initially. And here is his critique, and he launched quite an attack on what they were doing. He said the method of prayer that they have, the so-called hesychastic method, the one I just described, with praying and repeating the Jesus prayer seated with the head inclined towards the heart, was simply silly and superstitious at best. He said that the unceasing prayer that they are talking about, because of course the monks were talking about acquiring unceasing prayer, and this was part of the goal of practicing, having a discipline for practicing the Jesus prayer. He said, this is intellectual only, unceasing prayer. What this means, he says, is the acquisition of the habit of prayer. When you acquire the habit of prayer, this, he says, is unceasing prayer. The conscious knowledge that nothing is done without God's will. But the monks had a different understanding of what they were doing and described unceasing prayer in other ways. He also, when he heard them talking about the uncreated light, heard them talking about a distinction between essence and energies in God. He was horribly scandalized by this. He considered this heretical and superstitious. He identifies the energies completely with the divine essence. You can see where he's setting up a position which is essentially antithetical to hesychasm. He said, the monks speak about theoria, vision of God. They say it's possible to see God through the heart in this life. They say that deification is possible in this life. They say that in deification there is a direct, unmediated union with Christ. He says none of this is possible. He says you cannot see God in this life. That is for after death. And as for deification in this life, being a true direct union with Christ now, he said this also is not possible. The monks are completely mistaken. He heard them talking about apatheia, the release from the passions. He said apatheia is the mortification of the passions, putting them down, eradicating the passions, and eradicating with it what the fathers called the passible aspect or passible part of the soul. With regard to the body, he saw them praying using their body. This is one of the first things that scandalized him. He said the body cannot participate in pure prayer. Prayer, he says, is the activity of the intellect. The word in Greek is nous. Prayer is the activity of the nous alone. The presupposition is that the body presents an impediment to pure prayer. It becomes really, at best, the base instrument of the soul. And so, what we see here is that he sets up a situation in which he develops a position which is antithetical to hesychasm, hesychasm being the word that we use to describe this whole phenomenon of prayer, way of praying, which we identify not only with St. Gregory Palamas, but we also identify with St. Gregory of Sinai, whom I mentioned, and we identify, in fact, quite simply, with the spiritual practice of the Orthodox Church. It's not to say that in all Orthodox monasteries that the monks prayed in this way, but it is to say that hesychasm is not the invention of two major spiritual figures in the 14th century. It represents the continuation of what existed for a very, very long time. When Barlaam leveled his charges against the monks, especially the monks of Mount Athos, the charges, because they were very serious, could not be left unanswered. This became an issue in Constantinople in which everyone became involved. One has to see a society, understand that we have a society here which is not like ours, where there is a sharp division between church, state, and society. Here there is a complete integration, symphonia, of all of these. And so theology was the discussion in the marketplace. It was a political issue as much as a strictly religious one. The monks on Mount Athos were caught by surprise. They had never had someone from within the church. After all, Barlaam was Greek, even though he came from the West, if the expression West is in fact accurate. Some people argue that we shouldn't use East and West because there were Greek-speaking people in southern Italy and southern France. So geographically, East-West does not always work very accurately as a way to describe the situation. Nevertheless, in broad terms, we will say the West. And so the attack had come, so to speak, from within. And this was the first surprise. Secondly, it was an attack that came from someone who was very well educated and who knew Greek philosophy and who knew St. Dionysius. Well, St. Dionysius, of course, is very highly regarded in the East. St. Maximus, the confessor, depended on him very much, referred to him in his commentary on the Divine Liturgy. This put Barlaam in a rather powerful position. And of course, as I mentioned, he was an erudite man, a good speaker, made a good impression in Constantinople, already had friends and allies. When this man stands up and says what the Athonite monks are doing is at best superstitious, at worst completely heretical, it comes to the attention of the emperor. It was something that simply could not be left. So the monks, realizing that they had to present an apologia, a response, an apology in the proper sense of the word. The proper sense of the word, of course, apologia does not mean to say, I'm sorry, but it means to defend your position. Looked on the holy mountain for the monk who would be capable of crafting a response. They were not interested in finding a monk who would say anything new. Such is not the Athonite way. Rather, they were looking for a monk who could simply describe and defend what they did. And this is very important because some people accuse St. Gregory, Palamas, of being an innovator. He simply would not have understood such an accusation at all. He articulated what the Athonite monks believed and practiced. Yes, of course, when he was called upon to present a response to Barlaam, he went back to the fathers of the church who preceded him. He went back to Holy Scripture, and he presented a very well-based, very well-coordinated apologetic response. This is exactly what the monks were looking for, and the lot, as it were, fell to Gregory. He was well-educated and also a very, very erudite person, and the monks felt that he better than anyone else could summarize their beliefs, defend them, and demonstrate how they were grounded in the tradition of the church. As I mentioned earlier, it is very likely that we never would have heard from St. Gregory had this not happened, because we see that as a monastic, he was inclined to strict asceticism. He was happier in hermitages where he could simply pray and be by himself or with a small group of monks. Suddenly, this monk was catapulted onto the world stage. Now, the emperor and the bishops were listening to everything that he had to say. This struggle between St. Gregory Palamas and Barlaam really reached a very high level, so much so that councils of the church had to be called to deal with it. Sometimes St. Gregory was viewed in a very positive light. Sometimes political pressure was brought to bear and he was seen in a negative light. But now, with hindsight, we can look back and get more of a sense of the struggle and see where the church was at with his teaching. Barlaam's position was condemned in 1341 at a council. He returned to Italy, Barlaam, feeling defeated, of course, by the conciliar decree. Incredibly, this struggle between Barlaam and St. Gregory Palamas did not finish there. Barlaam had supporters in Constantinople, equally erudite, skilled in philosophy and theology. Indeed, St. Gregory, when he began his response, apologetic response to Barlaam, must have stepped on the toes of not a few people in Constantinople. And what we are able to see is that this discussion and disagreement was really wider than simply a disagreement between the monks, with St. Gregory representing them as their advocate, and Barlaam. There were, of course, intellectual currents of different types in Constantinople at the time. And of course, it would be unreasonable to think that Greeks would not be interested in philosophy. They were intensely interested, and Constantinople during this time period was really at its apex in terms of learning, not at its apex from the military point of, and political point of view. The empire was already beginning to crumble. However, intellectually, theologically, from the arts and everything, still in a time of kind of, if we can use it in the Orthodox sense, Renaissance, renewal of flourishing culture. In that, we see many philosophical currents, and I mentioned that clearly humanism is one of them. And what we discover is that there were people in Constantinople, intellectuals, who were opposed to hesychastic theology, what we now call simply Orthodox theology, because there's no real difference between the two. And we find that after Barlaam's return to Italy, Gregory Akinzinos and Nikephoros Gregoras, who both could be loosely termed humanists, take up what Barlaam had been doing before and launch a fresh attack on St. Gregory Palamas. Of course, it is also a time of severe instability in Constantinople, and you can see the struggles between dynasties at that point, almost bringing Constantinople really, essentially, we could describe the area in Thessaloniki as having been involved in a civil war. So not a happy period from the political point of view. More councils were called. 1347, another council. 1351. Finally, in 1351, this is considered the definitive and final council, and the synodal tomos of that synod is considered the normative statement of Orthodox doctrine. Interestingly enough, after that synod, the decisions were sent out to other Orthodox patriarchs, and other Orthodox patriarchs sent letters back to Constantinople acknowledging the synod as authoritative. Why I mentioned this is that this is exactly the process that one would expect to see with an ecumenical council, an ecumenical synod. That there would be a synod. It might or might not include bishops from the whole world, from the whole church. We know that the Second Ecumenical Synod, for example, did not have any substantial representation from the West at all. And nevertheless, it was accepted in the West as ecumenical. Here, the council was in Constantinople, 1351. However, the other Orthodox patriarchs sent in their agreement and approval, and what we have essentially is something that is very close to, if it isn't exactly, what one would see in an ecumenical council. In other words, the whole church gathers together to affirm the position of a synod. This is why St. Gregory Palamas is now considered in the Orthodox Church not simply as the spokesman for hesychasm. Of course, he is not the only spokesman for hesychasm. All of the other bishops that I mentioned, Metropolitan Theolyptos of Philadelphia, Patriarch Isidore, St. Gregory of Sinai, all of these are well-known spokesmen and defenders of hesychasm. Even better, they weren't simply defenders, they were practitioners. They were themselves holy men of prayer who practiced this prayer and were transformed people, to use very modern language. But St. Gregory's teaching specifically is received as not being innovative, but as expressing the mind of the Church. It is for this reason that St. Gregory not only has a day in November on which he is commemorated, a feast day, but he is also commemorated on the second Sunday of Great Lent. Of course, we are aware of the fact that this was added later, which is quite clear by the fact that he lived in the 14th century, and the Church had been celebrating Lent for a very long time before. Nevertheless, the Church commemorates St. Gregory Palamas on the second Sunday of Great Lent. It is, of course, important to see what this means. His commemoration is not there by accident. The first Sunday of Great Lent is now known as the Sunday of Orthodoxy. The third Sunday is the Sunday of the veneration of the Holy Cross. The second Sunday is the second part of the first. The Sunday of Orthodoxy, on which the Orthodox Church is proclaimed, many people associated, of course, with the restoration of the holy icons, appropriately, historically, it should be associated with that, of course. But it also became the day on which the Orthodox faith in general was proclaimed. The Orthodox faith is proclaimed again on the following Sunday, on the Sunday of St. Gregory Palamas. This is very clearly how it is understood in the Orthodox Church. He is not a father who is peripheral to the Orthodox Church. Rather, he expresses essentially what the Orthodox Church believes. So for us, he is very definitely an authoritative father, and his teachings represent, as I said already, the essence of what the Church believes, not only about prayer, but of course we come to see in the many writings of St. Gregory Palamas the Church's teaching and understanding on many different topics. I'd like to add that St. Gregory Palamas later was enthroned as the Archbishop of Thessaloniki. And there, the same man who had been forced to enter an exchange, a difficult exchange, which many people consider polemical, and indeed when you read the writings of St. Gregory and Barlaam, they do come across as polemical, each one defending a certain position and essentially trying to find the weak points of the other one. Many people know St. Gregory Palamas for his defense of hesychasm and his defense of the faith against Barlaam, and so they know his writings like the Triads, or perhaps the 150 chapters, but likely the Triads would be the work that people know the best. The same man wrote exquisitely beautiful homilies. There are 63 of them which survived and have now, fortunately, been gathered into a collection and translated into English with excellent annotation by Professor Benjamin at St. Tijuan's Orthodox Theological Seminary, with the assistance also of the monks of St. John the Baptist Monastery in Telishant Knights, Essex, England, and among them the wonderful Father Zacharias, who also assisted very much with this translation, produced a marvelous volume in English of these fabulous sermons. Most of them, but not all, were written as sermons to be preached to his flock. The same man who writes in the Triads and 150 chapters in a way which, to put it mildly, is not easy to understand. Of course, when Barlaam would challenge St. Gregory and ask him to prove a point logically, no one was better equipped to handle logic than St. Gregory, who never forgot his training in logic with his old teacher, Metochites, who had taught him Aristotelian philosophy. So, of course, when we try to read the Triads, we find it the writings enormously difficult to understand. One would really only be able to understand this fully by understanding the philosophical method and seeing exactly how he develops a point very strictly according to his training. However, when he is not engaged in this discussion and does not need to defend the orthodox position, and he addresses his flock, one sees nothing of this. One sees a very sensitive pastor who preaches very often on the same topics that he's addressing in the Triads, but from a completely different vantage point. His homilies are designed so that everybody who was familiar with Holy Scripture would understand him. We see the beautiful way in which he exegetes Holy Scripture, and we see how practical he is when he is addressing his flock, how he is able to take the depths of Orthodox theology and make it simple enough, while of course keeping it challenging as it always was and is when he addresses his flock. I'd like to stop just for a moment here